Europe's economy has returned to modest growth, marking a shift from the contractionary pressures seen in recent years. After a period defined by energy shocks, elevated inflation, and repeated recession concerns, the euro area is no longer shrinking. That change may appear subtle, but for the world's second-largest economic bloc, even modest expansion carries weight. Because Europe represents a significant share of global trade, cross-border investment flows, and industrial demand, its stabilization influences global expectations. When activity in Europe slows sharply, global manufacturing orders tend to weaken and export-dependent economies often feel the strain. When Europe stabilizes, even gradually, global markets begin to recalibrate. Recent data from Eurostat indicates that the euro area has maintained positive GDP growth, small but steady, moving away from technical recession territory. Even though growth remains below that of the United States, the important distinction is that output is expanding rather than contracting. This does not signal a boom, but it does signal an end to outright decline. Inflation tells a similar story of adjustment. Following the disruption of energy markets after the Russia-Ukraine war, price levels rose sharply across the continent. However, as energy supply conditions improved and demand pressures eased, inflation began to decline from its peak. Consumer price growth has gradually moved closer to the European Central Bank's target range, reducing the urgency of aggressive monetary tightening. At the same time, energy prices, though still above pre-crisis averages, have stabilized compared to the extreme volatility of 2022. Financial markets have reflected this shift with lower volatility and fewer emergency responses than during the height of the crisis. Beyond prices and markets, the labor market provides additional evidence of stability. Unemployment across much of the euro area remains relatively low by long-term historical standards, suggesting that the downturn did not trigger widespread job losses. However, this resilience does not imply uniform strength. Industrial activity remains uneven across the region. Germany continues to face weakness in manufacturing, particularly in energy-intensive sectors. At the same time, southern economies such as Spain and Italy have shown comparatively steadier performance, supported by services and tourism demand. Because Europe does not operate as a single synchronized engine, but as a complex structure of interconnected national economies moving at different speeds, this recovery does not appear uniform across the continent, and differences between countries are to be expected. But taken together, current indicators point not to renewed decline, but to stabilization. Europe is not experiencing a powerful rebound, yet it is also not slipping back into crisis. That distinction matters because it suggests the economy is gradually regaining balance after a period of significant pressure. So to understand why Europe now shows signs of recovery, it is necessary to first examine why its momentum weakened. Europe's slowdown did not happen overnight, and it was not the result of a single crisis. It was shaped by a series of structural choices made over more than a decade. After the global financial crisis, the euro area faced a sovereign debt emergency that threatened the stability of the common currency itself. Countries in southern Europe, particularly Greece, Spain, Portugal, and Italy, struggled with high debt levels, weak growth, and rising borrowing costs. To restore credibility in financial markets, fiscal consolidation became the central priority across much of the continent. Balanced budgets, deficit reduction, and debt stabilization were placed above aggressive expansion. This strategy succeeded in preventing a breakdown of the euro, but it came with a cost. Public investment declined in many countries, infrastructure spending slowed, and long-term growth potential weakened. Europe chose stability over speed, and that choice shaped the decade that followed. At the same time, economic divergence inside the euro area became more visible. Northern economies such as Germany and the Netherlands maintained strong export competitiveness and relatively low unemployment. Southern economies faced persistently higher joblessness, slower productivity gains, and limited fiscal flexibility. Because these countries shared a single currency, they could not adjust through exchange rates in the way independent economies normally would. Internal adjustment required wage moderation, structural reform, and painful fiscal tightening. That process took time, and in many cases it reduced short-term growth even further. Just as parts of Europe were beginning to stabilize, a new external shock emerged. The Russia-Ukraine war triggered a dramatic surge in energy prices across the continent. Europe, particularly Germany, had built an industrial model that relied heavily on affordable imported energy. When gas supplies were disrupted and prices spiked, Energy-intensive manufacturing sectors faced immediate pressure. Production costs rose, margins narrowed, and some industrial output contracted. The vulnerability of a manufacturing-centered growth model became clear. At the same time, another gap widened more quietly. The United States entered a new growth phase driven by large technology firms, artificial intelligence investment, and digital infrastructure expansion. American capital markets supported rapid scaling of technology companies, and productivity growth accelerated in certain sectors. Europe, by contrast, invested more cautiously in digital and semiconductor industries. Its technology ecosystem remained fragmented across national borders, and venture capital funding was comparatively smaller. Over time, this difference translated into slower productivity growth. Demographics added another layer of pressure. Europe's population is aging rapidly, and projections indicate a gradual decline in the working-age population over the coming decades. A shrinking labor force places downward pressure on potential output unless offset by productivity gains or migration. Even before the latest crises, these demographic trends were already reducing long-term growth expectations. Taken together, fiscal restraint, internal divergence, energy vulnerability, technological lag, and demographic headwinds created a prolonged period of subdued expansion. Europe did not collapse, but its momentum slowed steadily. The continent became more stable, yet less dynamic. Yet in recent years, some of those underlying choices are beginning to shift. The most immediate change has been in the inflation environment and the broader monetary backdrop. After a prolonged period of elevated price pressures, inflation across the euro area has eased, allowing the European Central Bank to move away from emergency tightening toward a more stable rate stance. This does not mean monetary policy has become loose, but it does reduce the level of uncertainty that had weighed on businesses and households. Financial markets, which once reacted sharply to every inflation release and policy signal, have shown more measured responses, reflecting a calmer macroeconomic environment. As price volatility subsides, planning horizons become longer. Companies are more willing to commit to investment decisions when input costs are less unpredictable. Consumers, facing slower price growth, regain a degree of purchasing stability. This shift in the monetary and inflation landscape creates space for broader structural adjustments to take place. Industrial activity, while still uneven, has begun to show signs of partial normalization. Certain segments of manufacturing that were hit hardest by the energy shock have stabilized as supply conditions improved and alternative energy sources were secured. Defense spending discussions across Europe have also introduced a new source of industrial demand. While military budgets remain smaller than those of global superpowers, commitments to increase defense expenditure toward higher GDP targets signal potential expansion in aerospace, advanced manufacturing, and strategic materials sectors. Investment announcements from defense firms and related suppliers suggest that this demand is not purely theoretical, but increasingly concrete. Fiscal policy is also evolving. For much of the past decade, fiscal discipline was defined primarily through restraint. Balanced budgets and strict deficit limits dominated political debates. Now, particularly in countries such as Germany, there is growing discussion about relaxing certain fiscal constraints to support strategic investment. This does not represent a full abandonment of fiscal prudence, but it does mark a shift from austerity toward selective expansion. Public investment in energy infrastructure, digital networks, and industrial modernization is receiving renewed attention. Another significant adjustment is unfolding in global supply chains. European policymakers and corporations are reassessing exposure to external dependencies, especially in critical technologies and raw materials. The objective is not complete isolation, but diversification and resilience. Efforts to secure semiconductor production capacity, battery manufacturing, and clean energy inputs reflect a broader strategy of strategic autonomy. At the same time, energy sourcing has diversified, reducing reliance on a single supplier and lowering vulnerability to geopolitical shocks. Taken together, these changes suggest that Europe is not merely recovering from a cyclical downturn. It is gradually repositioning its economic structure. The current phase is less about rapid expansion and more about recalibration. Short-term growth remains moderate, but the underlying architecture of the economy is being adjusted in response to lessons learned from past crises. However, Europe's repositioning is not confined within its own borders. As internal adjustments take shape, The European Union has also been redefining its external economic relationships. This shift is visible in the renewed momentum behind several major trade agreements. One of the most significant developments is the long-discussed agreement with Mercosur countries in South America. If fully implemented, this arrangement would deepen trade ties with Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay, expanding access to agricultural goods, industrial products, and automotive markets. For Europe, it represents both a commercial opportunity and a strategic move to secure supply channels beyond traditional partners. For South America, it opens a large consumer market with high purchasing power. The agreement has faced political resistance, particularly around environmental standards and agricultural competition, yet negotiations have continued, signaling Europe's determination to broaden its trade footprint. At the same time, discussions with India have gained renewed attention. India is one of the world's fastest-growing major economies and a central player in global supply chains. A comprehensive trade agreement would give European firms improved access to a vast emerging market, while allowing India greater entry into European services and technology sectors. Beyond tariffs, the negotiations involve digital standards, intellectual property protections, and investment rules, reflecting the complexity of modern trade. Engagement with India is not only about growth, but also about diversification. In Southeast Asia, the European Union has strengthened ties with individual ASEAN members. Existing agreements with Vietnam and Singapore provide frameworks for tariff reductions and regulatory cooperation. These partnerships support European companies seeking production alternatives and help integrate Southeast Asia more closely into Europe's trade network. As global supply chains become more regionally distributed, these relationships gain additional importance. Europe has also maintained and expanded its established agreements with advanced economies. The Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with Canada and the Economic Partnership Agreement with Japan continue to anchor Europe within a network of rules-based trade relationships. These frameworks emphasize regulatory alignment, dispute resolution mechanisms, and high standards in labor and environmental policy. They reinforce Europe's identity as a defender of multilateral trade norms at a time when global trade governance faces pressure. Taken together, these initiatives illustrate a broader strategic approach. Rather than relying heavily on a single dominant partner, Europe appears to be building a network-based model of economic engagement. The objective is to reduce overdependence, particularly on China in critical sectors, while recalibrating its relationship with the United States in a more balanced manner. This does not imply confrontation, but it does reflect an effort to expand autonomy through diversification. In a world of shifting alliances and supply disruptions, interconnected partnerships may provide greater resilience than narrow bilateral dependence. Yet having a strategy does not eliminate structural constraints. Europe's external positioning may be evolving, but several internal limitations remain deeply rooted. These constraints do not guarantee decline, but they shape the pace and scale of any potential resurgence. Demographics are among the most significant long-term pressures. Europe's population is aging faster than many other major economies, and projections suggest a gradual decline in the working-age population over the coming decades. A smaller labor force limits the economy's ability to expand output unless productivity rises substantially. At the same time, aging societies face higher pension and healthcare obligations, increasing fiscal pressure on governments already managing high debt levels. This combination places downward pressure on potential GDP growth. Productivity growth presents another challenge. While European workers remain highly skilled, average productivity gains have lagged behind those of the United States in recent years. Part of this gap is linked to differences in digital adoption and scale. Large technology firms in the United States have been able to deploy capital rapidly, integrate artificial intelligence across industries, and scale platforms globally. Europe's more fragmented corporate landscape and regulatory environment have made similar scaling more complex. As a result, productivity acceleration has been uneven. The technology gap is particularly visible in sectors such as artificial intelligence, advanced semiconductors, and digital platforms. Although Europe possesses strong research institutions and engineering talent, commercial leadership in these industries often lies elsewhere. Capital markets in Europe are less integrated than in the United States, and venture financing remains more limited across national boundaries. Without deeper financial integration, scaling innovative firms across the continent remains slower than in more unified markets. Energy costs continue to weigh on competitiveness. Even after recent stabilization, industrial energy prices in Europe remain higher on average than in the United States. Energy-intensive manufacturing sectors therefore operate under tighter margins. While diversification has reduced vulnerability to supply disruptions, price competitiveness remains a structural concern for heavy industry. Political fragmentation adds another layer of complexity. The European Union is a union of sovereign states with differing fiscal capacities, economic priorities, and domestic political pressures. Reaching consensus on fiscal integration, defense spending coordination, or industrial policy often requires prolonged negotiation. This structure provides stability and shared governance, but it can also slow decisive action. Taken together, these factors form a set of structural boundaries. They do not prevent recovery, but they limit how quickly and how far Europe can move. The continent's future will depend not only on cyclical improvements, but on how it navigates these deeper constraints. So the central question becomes unavoidable. Where is Europe heading from here? At this moment, Europe is not entering a phase of rapid expansion, but neither is it sliding back into crisis. Instead, it is moving through a period that can best be described as economic realignment. The sharp shocks that once dominated the conversation have eased, and the focus has gradually shifted from crisis management to long-term structural positioning. This does not mean Europe is on the verge of reclaiming unquestioned superpower status. In the near term, growth rates are unlikely to match those of faster expanding regions. Demographic constraints, productivity challenges, and geopolitical uncertainty will continue to shape the ceiling of expansion. So the global economic hierarchy is unlikely to be rewritten overnight, yet a more measured outcome appears plausible. Moderate and steady growth is a realistic scenario if current stabilization continues. Industrial modernization, supply chain diversification, and targeted investment in technology and energy infrastructure could gradually improve resilience. If productivity reforms gain traction and capital allocation becomes more efficient across member states, the medium-term outlook could strengthen. The decisive variables will lie beneath headline growth numbers. How Europe addresses aging populations, how effectively it integrates its capital markets, and how quickly it scales innovation in strategic sectors will determine whether stabilization evolves into sustained expansion. Recovery in this context is not a single event but a process. Europe may or may not return to the very center of the global economic system. That outcome is not predetermined. What is clear is that the continent is not unraveling. It is reorganizing. The direction of growth has already shifted, even if the speed remains gradual.